without further ado, Michael Kennedy! Thank you. I felt almost like I should come out for some professional wrestling. Never associated you-yous with that, but you know, there's always a first time. Jim did say that I should say a little bit about my own background. I'm a sociologist. That's all you need to know. But I could, go ahead and start talking where I'm really from, because I grew up in Pennsylvania Dutch country. And so if you can hear this way I'm talking now, that's the way I grew up. And then I went to the South, and I was laughed at for talking like that. I don't know why. And so I wound up acquiring all these ways of speaking that I really admired in North Carolina. And just the other day, I'm teaching introductory sociology right now. And I had lapsed back into this old way of talking. I started saying you guys or yous guys. And I was getting these looks, and I said, oh, of course. This is a kind of sexist way of addressing a collective. So I said, y'all. And somebody in the back of the room said, that's right. And I said, yeah, I'm going back to my roots. And they didn't believe me. But I do have powerful North Carolina roots that move me. But I also have Unitarian Universalist roots. Supposed to go, or you can go, you. So I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan between 1986 and 2009. And I and my children's mother raised our two children to be Unitarian Universalists. This was a religion of choice because we wanted our children to grow up in a literate, thoughtful, reasoned fashion. And I was blessed, I can say unabashedly, for having had that environment in which not only could I raise my children, not only could I participate in the religious education of so many children, but that I could acquire my own religious education. And in particular, I was mentioning to one of your colleagues here, Ken Pfeiffer was my minister. And Ken was a remarkable person. The most amazing moment for me was when he translated my deep Catholicism into Unitarian Universalism by explaining that grace is not something that comes from on high, but rather comes from us to one another. Standing on the side of love, it feels to me, is a way of extending grace as human agency. So I'm really grateful to be in this company. I'm especially grateful to be able to have such wonderful colleagues who do the real work of white allyship and everything surrounding it. I think what I will try to communicate today is that I'm a sociologist, I'm an academic, and I do things in my own way, but I don't do things in the way that I find sufficient. And so I'm looking forward to learning from my colleagues about how I might do that. I also want to give a little shout out to Keith Brown, because if I can say about anyone at Brown University who's a treasure at that university, Keith is. He has always kept me grounded. He has always taught me the way of love, even in academic environments. So you all are so lucky to have him here. So there may be some other folks who come in from Brown tonight, some of my friends and colleagues, from whom I've especially learned about the challenges of white allyship. May be coming, but sometimes it's hard to find. You're so far from Brown. You can't always quite get here, so it may not be the case. But one of my colleagues is here, Marta Knudsen, who is here from Norway. And you'll especially applaud her when you learn the kind of research she does. I will leave it to her to explain in informal circumstances, but I think everyone here could be a research partner for her. So, I'm going to clock myself, but you make sure to clock me, like that too. And then I go over, because academics have a tendency to do that. But I would like to make this presentation in using some arbitrary number, maybe 7. Maybe I'll use 7 principles to think about it. See, this is a total inside joke for those of you who are not here in person. Here I was thinking that this would issue uproarious laughter, but UUs are usually skeptical. So they didn't really know if I knew what I was talking about. So let me begin with 7 principles, And the first principle is a simple declarative statement. I am not a white ally. I'm not a white ally because it's not for me to say. Because if I say it, that means I'm performing for you. I want your appreciation. I want your attention. I want your applause. It's not for me to say. And in fact, it's part of a much broader statement that when white folks are struggling alongside folks for racial justice, it's not white folks who get to declare what the principles are. It's not white folks who get to declare what the struggle is. It's not white folks who get to declare who's leading. In particular, one of the things that you'll see if you visit the White Noise Collective website, one of the things that's a really important point, and this is what makes this sort of a little awkward for me, is that white folks shouldn't be taking up the air in the room. But this is I'm glad it's not an all-white audience, but it's a mostly white audience. So that allows us actually to think about that point right here. So, but I think one of the things that we need to do whenever we think about the first principle of our 7 principles, right, and thinking about white allyship, is that when we're talking about racial justice, when we're talking about white allyship, people of color define the terms of struggle. That has several implications for white folks. But one of the most important things, this is a talk on white allyship, but it is impossible to talk about racial justice, it's impossible to talk about white allyship without all sorts of other forms of oppression. We need, whenever we're talking about the struggle for justice, of course, I'm speaking to Unitarian Universalists, and y'all get this, obviously. Whenever we're speaking about the struggle for justice, it is not a single struggle for justice. Intersectionality is the typical term that we use because it's also a struggle against ableism. It's also a struggle against transphobia. It's also a struggle against classism and other kinds of oppressions. So I'm going to be speaking primarily about race tonight because that's what the principal object is, but whenever we're talking about racial injustice, we should be thinking about all of the other kinds of injustice, but I'm going to come back and complicate this. So the first principle, people of color define the terms of struggle. White folks need to listen and learn from people of color and definitely not tell them why injustice reigns. I can't tell you how many of my white friends do that all the time. And what the best mode of struggle happens all the time. So we should be mindful, and this is the thing that I think is really quite moving in the moment of Black Lives Matter. So many people would come on board, so many white people would come on board now that Black Lives Matter. Forgetting that people have been struggling over making Black Lives Matter for centuries. It's just that white folks are beginning to appreciate the degree to which that has been overlooked, that has been ignored, that has been denied. So, and one more point in this regard. There's a really interesting, so one of the things that for me is the most important thing when I think about being a white ally is to improve my listening skills, which gets harder as I age because I'm trying to deny the importance of hearing aids. But I am trying to work on my listening skills, and I'll say more about that in a little bit. But here's a really interesting flip. I was working with one of my colleagues, and she was describing to me this struggle, I suspect many of you were involved with this, over getting driver's licenses for undocumented folks. And this friend happened to be a student at Brown, And so she was bringing her friends from Brown. She was bringing her friends from the community. And they went up to the house, to the Capitol. And the Brown students were sitting quiet. They learned a lesson that they're not supposed to be taking up the space. But her co-organizer from the community came up to her and said, why are they not saying anything? We want them to come up. And she realized, oh, there's a Brown University culture that's trying to make up for decades of Brown University students speaking for those who are disadvantaged. And so the pendulum has swung occasionally in the other direction where they don't want to speak. And so finally my friend went up to them and said, why aren't you coming up? You're being invited to come up. And they said, well, it's not our place. And the activist from the community said, no, it is your place. I need you up there. Do you know why I need you up there? Because I need folks with your privilege to affirm why it's better for everyone that we have driver's licenses. So the point from this is that I think the first principle is that, yes, people of color lead the struggle for racial justice. But that doesn't mean that you shut down and follow automatic rules. You figure out how to listen and how to be aware and how to know how you can contribute. So that's first point number one. Point number two, principle number two, the second principle. I forgot when you said the new principle, so forgive me. But I remember the last one, I think, but we'll see. So the second principle in this is that there's this phrase that I learned recently called white ally theater, where white allies want to go out and be seen. And you can see this, I don't know how many of you do Twitter, you can see this readily on Twitter. When people say, like unnecessary things just to be there, to be seen, and to get some likes even. Or to go to demonstrations and say, I was there, and do selfies. I actually have a hashtag Prof. Kennedy selfie, so I can't rock that much. But it's like this performance that I am progressive too. But one of the things I think that I've learned from my colleagues who have been trying to teach me about what being a better white ally is that we have so much to do within our own communities. That, yes, if we're going to go to a demonstration, we probably should be on the perimeter, especially if there's a potential for violence. So that, after all, white folks are less likely to be assaulted by the police than are people of color. It helps if we're on the perimeter to put our quote-unquote bodies on the line to do that. That's where it looks like it matters. But we don't have to be dramatic to matter. One of the things that I think is, I'm accustomed to using two hands for covering my screen. We have plenty to do within our own community, right? So, there's something in a Seattle paper recently which I really loved. And I think it came around Thanksgiving time. And it was about what happens when your relative starts going off. Right? And I can't tell you, I think I was actually here around your holidays. And every progressive congregation starts talking about what to do with those racist, reactionary family members, right? And this essay, I can share links perhaps later as a resource, but White Noise probably has them all. And this was such a great response. It was like, if you're silent, you're complicit. But you don't have to be an asshole. So if I won't say who because I don't know if this is being recorded. But I can imagine, I often talk in hypotheticals. I can imagine a family member going off and saying something horrendous. I know I'll never have that conversation with that person again if I go ahead and say, stop being such a racist asshole. That's not going to be the way. So there's this expression, to connect before you correct. And there are ways of talking, and there's so many resources to think about how it is that you can challenge, not let it go, but provide the space for the continuing conversation. And what's striking to me is that whenever I was speaking, especially a couple of years ago, saying, I want to go out, I want to do something meaningful, my colleagues and friends who are in this racial justice struggle were often sitting back and said, yeah, you can do something, right? Go back to your department. Go back to your family. Go back to that extended network. Because that's where you can really make a difference. But if it's only that, it looks a little bit too simple. So let me share with you a moment from Brown University, which was incredibly awkward, incredibly difficult. I was sitting around, we were talking about the Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan. So this is going to become even more fictional, but real. And we were sitting around talking, and one person was saying some things, and then some students of color started challenging that guy. And he got all worked up, got all defensive. He said, "Stop calling me a racist. I'm not a racist. And in fact, when you're calling me this racist, you're alienating a potential ally. I am your ally. You don't get it. So stop calling me a racist." And this is, white noise 101, right? Because one of the things that revealed was that he was thinking way more about him than he was thinking about the people who were insulted by what he was saying. But then, what blew me away, and it only confirms to me that people who look like me and who are similarly aged as I am, and sometimes even older, sometimes even younger, don't know so much. Because after he went on his tirade, challenging these young people of color for calling him out, they tried to call him in. They said, "We weren't calling you a racist. We were just reflecting on the ways in which," and believe it or not, we talk like this in sociology. "We were just reflecting on the ways in which your practice reproduced structures of racist domination." And in fact, we have an even more profound question. We would rather ask not who's a racist and who's not a racist, but how is it possible not to be a racist? How is it possible not to be a racist if you're living in a deeply racist society? So all of a sudden, they flipped the conversation. He should have stepped up and said, "Yeah, I recognize this," but he didn't. Right? But what it enabled us to do was to recover from this clash and then to say, so what would it look like if we were engaging in anti-racist practice rather than passively colorblind racist? That's the second point in principle number 2. The third one is a very personal one. I went to Davidson College as an undergraduate, and when they asked me what I was interested in studying, right from the start I said race relations. Because even as a high school student, even though I grew up in nearly all-white Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, for some reason, Huey P. Newton's Revolutionary Suicide was my favorite book. I don't know how that happened, but it was. So I thought, I really like to study race, and that's why I started taking sociology courses. And I didn't like the sociology. It was fine initially, but I found it later. And so I knew I had incredible book learning. Every sociologist has to understand the structure of racism. But not every sociologist has to feel the structure of racism. And in fact, I had no idea how deeply rooted was my white privilege until about 2011. And it happened at Brown. Do you remember when Ray Kelly? I know. All you have to do is say Ray Kelly, and everybody goes, oh yeah, we know. Right? So when Ray Kelly came to speak, he was the former head of the NYPD. He's very much associated with stop and frisk. And there was a substantial protest, mobilization by students to try. And this is a long story, and in fact, I would encourage you all, because this is a remarkable story that has been documented, the actual progress of events and the implications of it. I think people could tell the story much better than I better here. So I won't tell the story. I invite you to look at it. But the big story is something I could read about. The real story for me was that one of my most brilliant, powerful, thoughtful students came into my office after the night of that community engagement where they were reflecting on the trauma of this day. She came into my office. She was too strong to ever shed a tear. But I'm, like this weak Irish Catholic guy, I'll cry at the first sign of injustice. She came in and she said to me, Michael, I don't feel like I belong here. And even now, when I think about this, I get really upset. I feel this because this was one of the most important colleagues I have ever had in my life. And at this place that was employing me, she didn't feel like she belonged. Why? Because when she and her boyfriend walked into that meeting, both African American, walked into that meeting, they stopped them and said, "Where's your ID? This is for Brown students." On the very day after! No, or that night. It was unbelievable. So from that point forward, she and I began collaborating much more. Because it's like it stabbed me in the heart. But that wasn't a real profound learning, because I knew my heart was with her, that I stood on the side of love with her. We were coming back from a particularly intense day where we were fighting bureaucracy to try to get a course permitted. We failed. But we were trying. And I was so tired. I was so tired. I looked at her and I said, oh, I can't wait to get home, put my feet up and forget about this for a while. This is the drop mic moment, right? I couldn't wait. And she just looked at me and said, Michael, I'm glad you can do that. And that was the moment where I did something other than understand the structure and dynamics of racism. I recognized my complicity in this structure and dynamics because I could let it go for a while and go home and watch some TV. Everybody has to be able to recuperate. Everybody needs self-care. But I didn't forget about it. That 50 years later, 40 years later, I don't make myself older than I am. 40 years later, maybe, when I finally got it. Part of the way. Part of the way, because I'm still trying to get it. So the second principle, and obviously the principles are going to speed up right here, is that there's plenty of work in the white community for white folks to carry on the struggle against racial injustice. In fact, that's where we're most valuable. Because we can use our community, we can use our privilege, we can use our access to all of these institutions of power in order to make a difference and make a change. Principle number 3 is that actions speak a lot louder than words. And even speaking is a little bit more consequential than reading. I've been reading my whole life. I've been speaking my whole professional life. But I haven't been acting like I should. There is this nomenclature. One of the things that's, I think, extraordinary about what White Noise Collective is part of, and this whole major initiative to help white folks become aware, is that there's this whole vocabulary out there that could really enhance what we do. Sociologists actually believe quite a bit. Until we name something, it's not real. And I think this is sort of true, right? And we actually sometimes introduce words that clarify how society works. How many of you know self-fulfilling prophecy? Right? Everybody knows that. That's a sociologist term, Robert Merton, 1940s. Right? So we introduce these terms because they help us clarify the way society works. I was teaching cultural sociology last fall, and my colleagues Amy, Prab, and Maria in particular were challenging the way in which I was thinking about allyship. And they said, that's a nice word, that white allyship. But actually there's a much stronger word that you should be thinking about and using. What does it mean to be an accomplice? So there's this, actually if you want to look it up later, www.whiteaccomplice. That'll give you a sense. And they introduce a nice distinction. There are folks who are actors, who are kind of like spectators in a game. We watch, we might even applaud, we might try to say, hey, look at that. Then there are the allies, who will do a little bit more. They might, actually disrupt and educate in these spaces of whiteness, like I have done in these meetings, saying, but, what about? But then there are those who are accomplices. Those who are really actively thinking about how to disrupt the ways in which racism works. This is what I think of as white noise. Because it's very clear if you look at what they do, they are not just white allies. They are accomplices because, if I may say, they are actively challenging the institutions, but not in the lead. One of the things that I think is remarkable of what they do is to offer childcare for people of color who want to become more active and don't have that childcare available. What is that? That's not the selfie. That's the kind of support that represents what the struggle is about. Not for white folks to get out the front, but for white folks to be supportive of the change that needs to happen. Check those things out. There's all sorts of great things on social media. In particular, I'm not going to go to that right now. But let me go to the fourth principle because it's pretty complicated and I have like 5 minutes left. And how many principles do y'all have? So, think I didn't notice that? Yeah, I remember them now. Thank you. That's great, actually. So, one of the things that was said at the beginning, and one of the things that's really important, is to be intersectional, right? And this is where I still don't get it. Because everybody declares they're intersectional if they're truly progressive, if they're sufficiently progressive. But whenever we're being intersectional, especially when we're, white cis males like me, what do I choose to emphasize? Here I'm emphasizing race because this is the subject. But even this was profoundly inadequate because I failed to do something that I ought to have if Kumu Ramsey Town was as good a teacher as he is. Kumu Ramsey Town was my colleague from Hawaii who came here to, I do martial arts, I teach a course on sociology and martial arts. He came here to teach martial arts sociology because he's a master in Lua. But he's indigenous Hawaiian. And he wrote to me and asked, "Who will welcome me?" And I thought, wow, yes. I mean, I've met him only once, but I guess I could get the president of the university to welcome him. Maybe, I don't know. So I wrote back to him and I said, "Well, who would you like to meet?" Because I have, connections across the university. And he said, "Nobody from the university." Who from the Narragansett people might welcome me? And look at this. Most people in this room, I suspect, if I looked at your expressions when I said Narragansett, said, "Oh, that's interesting." But this is one of the great indicators for me about how, when we speak of racism, we can readily think about Black Lives Matter, and we should. We can readily think about the sanctuary movement, and we should. I'm glad to hear who your speaker will be next time. We should think about Islamophobia, and we should. But it is amazing to me, on the very day in which there's a protest in Washington, D.C. against the Dakota Access Pipeline, where so many of our sisters and brothers who are struggling for Native, Indigenous rights are there, and we don't know that we are guests in their land. So for me, the challenge is often, how do we think about intersectionality? Which oppressions are we recognizing, and how do they sync together? How do they articulate with one another? And I think the answer, if I try to provide it in sociological terms, is profoundly wrong. Because the answer is not an academic question. This is my fifth point, principle. Providence, Rhode Island, not Providence County, Rhode Island, Providence and Rhode Island, is the microcosm where we might begin to figure out how to create our own intersectionalities. Why? Because the only way we can figure out how to be on the side of love, how it is that we can recognize the structure and dynamics of oppressions, is to be involved in struggles. Is to get the sense of what that microcosm is of the global injustice that we all seek to remedy. It's by connecting with people who are already in the struggle. It's by looking around and figuring out what are those organizations out there with which I can connect as an individual. How many of you went to the Women's March protest down here? How many of you went to the Muslim ban protest? A little bit fewer. It's not such a sunny day. I wrote about both of them, and both of those protests made me feel love and solidarity like I hadn't felt in a long time. It gave me a sense of hope because I recognized a lot of people I knew that I didn't know would be there. And I recognized a lot of people that I want to get to know because I could sense that we could be connected. We could be together. And for me, when I think about how to be an ally, it doesn't mean trying to figure it out in advance. It means connecting with people who are in the business of making racial justice happen. That's the fifth. Actually, one of the people we had hoped would come is Kevin Escudero from Brown University. He's one of these people that we need to connect with. And if he hadn't been delayed in his own contributions elsewhere, he would have been here. But he said that one of the things we could be thinking about here are 5 things, just 5 bullets. So pay attention, because he is involved in the struggle, especially around sanctuary and the struggle of undocumented. He said this: first, ask how faith communities respond with love and care and concern, but also in a culturally aware manner. I know you use love to hug, but not everybody wants to hug. Okay. Second, Know Your Rights trainings. Dorcas is providing these trainings. Cosecha is providing these trainings. Connect to these organizations that are protecting the rights of those who are most vulnerable. Third, think about welcoming events, right? This is a ready thing for you types. So provide incredible dinners, like you did, care packages, etc. Immigrant and refugee families and individuals. Good suggestion. Fourth, this is really important. Put in place a plan of action, setting out roles of who would do what at the church or congregation here. If someone was in need of sanctuary. Do you already have the game plan? Who's going to do what? Probably. I knew you were working on it. You use plan. Sometimes plan to death. And then lastly, police and local law enforcement accountability. Right? Be part of that struggle. Make sure that the Providence Community Safety Act is recognized and acknowledged. Lastly, keep in mind that this is not only a Latinx issue. Okay, sixth point. As a sociologist, I try to put on my professional voice now. When we're thinking about allyship, accompliceness, is that the word? What's the time frame we're using? What's the temporality that we're thinking about? I actually think this is really important because you need to step up right away sometimes. You need to go to that protest now. But why? For the selfie? No. You need to think about what that protest is enabling, what those contacts are that could translate into something more. But for what time period? For next week? For the next community meeting? The next time you need to have a memo written? No. We need to think not only about today, not only about next month, not only even about next year, and not only about 2018 and 2020. We need to think about the kind of society we want to be built in for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. This is where I become furious. Because the society we're creating right now is not something I want to leave to my children, to my friends' children, to my friends' great-grandchildren. I don't want to see that happen. So we need solidarity now. And the way in which solidarity is built is not by all of us saying, we're in this together, because we're not. Some of us are at risk right now. Some of us have the privilege to say, I'm tired. I'm going to go home and watch TV. My question is, for such a thoughtful congregation as Unitarian Universalists are, this is the community of reason. This is the community of love. This is the community of justice in the here and now and not the hereafter. This is why I'm so happy to be in this environment with all of you. Because if we can create an alternative for the future, it has to be built in the present. We have to anticipate the society we want by performing that society now. And that leads to the seventh principle. Never talk too much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to spend only 5 minutes on questions for Michael that are primarily informative. We're going to have a big discussion at the end of this, but if you have particular things on your mind, will you please ask? And we have more than 100 people here, so please keep your comments to about 30 seconds, all right? So a question for Michael, something you guys say that you want to comment on, or something you'd like to have him clarify. Thank you very much. Ben.
I would like to define for us intersectionality.
Define intersectionality.
I discussed a lot of this too, but I've been sociologist for a long time.
So intersectionality refers to the articulation of all sorts of different kinds of oppressions in any particular body. And so one of the most common ways to think about this is to think about the ways in which, if we struggle only for racial justice, gender justice, and sexuality justice, will not be necessarily recognized. If we only think about the Women's March and think about gender, we may not think about how white that march was, especially in DC, right? So we need to think about how all these oppressions come together. One of the typical ways in which I think intersectionality is discussed is with that triplet of race, gender, and sexuality. But it's not limited to that. And so one of the things that, in fact, we just taught about intersectionality in the sociology course, it was really striking, right? What got the students mobilized to think about intersectionality? And actually, which students were mobilized thinking about intersectionality? Oh, it wasn't all the students who were my younger version. They were saying, oh, that's kind of curious. So by having this frame, it's actually a way of opening up conversations and creating much more dynamic conversations. It actually doesn't allow for one oppression to define the terms of everything. And so this is why racial justice is not the only thing, and it's sort of complicated.
So in old-fashioned terms, we might think of it as eliminating the silos of the sections.
That's a nice way to think about it. Yes, okay.
Professor Kennedy,
Oh, come on, Michael.
my thinking is that before Donald Trump came to the fore, we were not as involved as a people in protesting and fighting for justice in all of these fronts. Now, all of a sudden, it looks as if, wham, we all have to get involved with this. And I would like your comments on that.
Comment on the impact of the Trump presidency.
It's huge! And it's huge because, as so many people say, he's doing exactly as he promised.
Doing exactly
As he promised he would.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's even worse than we would have imagined. My introductory sociology course is organized around this question. The sociological imagination is the thing we typically associate with sociology. It was written by C. Wright Mills in 1959. If you were to write the sociological imagination today, how would you rewrite it? Every week, we're faced with a new challenge. However, one of the things that's quite apparent, and I've written a whole bunch of things on the sociology of Trump for Rhode Island Future, RIfuture.org. Yeah?
Yeah.
And so that's a plug. It's a great site. Truly great. The best. But where was I going?
Your sociology
Impact
class.
of the Trump presidency.
Sociology class.
So the problem is that all of a sudden, one of the things that's really interesting is that we just got woke. Oh wait, who's the we in this? Right? Because one of the interesting problems here is that we now have potentially broad counter, I'm going to sound sociological, even Gramscian. Broad counter-hegemonic movement right now. Very broad alternative being cast across all of these different sectors. But there are some sectors that have been mobilizing in opposition well before this. Black Lives Matter is this great example of how this was mobilized before Trump. In fact, of course, Obama was called the deporter-in-chief. So there are these injustices that preceded Trump. It's just that he's so extreme that our sociological imaginations were unprepared. And this, for me, is one of the big problems that we face. We don't have the imagination we need to be able to see how bad things can get. We also need the imagination to be able to say, what will it take to make this planet deserving of our descendants? Deserving for our descendants. We need that positive imagination, but I'm afraid that we're not going to fuel that mobilization for justice unless we recognize the disruption that is on our doorstep. Yes?
I just wonder how you see people being able to mitigate apathy. I mean, we see so much of it now, and I think a lot of people just either throw their hands up or just say, this is what we have. How do you effectively combat or maybe engage apathy to turn that around?
How do you engage people in this struggle, particularly when many are apathetic?
Send them for a drink with me. Send them for a drink with me. No, I'm joking, because when I was teaching these introductory sociology students, this was C. Wright Mill's concern, that people are apathetic. And I said, that's not our concern anymore. People are polarized. People are hating on each other. So, but this is why I still am a sociologist, because I know we don't know everybody.
We don't know everybody.
We don't know everybody. He's my buddy. We don't know everybody, and this is, I think, the key data point, right? Is that there are people who are apathetic out there. In fact, I listened to One Square Mile on I love that story. What, you did that? Because that's a clear signal for all of us from Providence that we need to get out to Johnston, right? Because we don't know what they're thinking, and they're just down the road.
Jen?
47% of the people in this country voted for Donald Trump, and they don't necessarily live where we live, and they don't necessarily see themselves as racist, and they do see themselves as forgotten people who are dealing with everyday struggles, and they do see themselves as silenced by us
Yes.
and forgotten by us.
Yes.
How can we talk with them? They don't even use language and ideas in the same way. Everything you said today would hit them and bounce right back.
Yep.
They hate everything that we're saying and doing, and they're not listening to us.
How can we connect with the 47? How can we connect with the 47 people who voted?
47.
He's such an optimist. All right, we better make this the last point because white noise has way more important things to say than I do. But there are two things that are important in this. One is that we have tons of sociological research about this. Arlie Hochschild is one of the people everybody knows. And you're even using, I think, some of her language, the people that are forgotten, the people who feel like others have come ahead of them in the queue. We should listen to that. And if I were, and I suspected there were not too many people in a UU congregation that believe in rapture. Oh no, it's more inclusive than I thought. But if you were believers in rapture, you know who I would be invoking right now? The leader of Moral Mondays. The Reverend Dr. Barber from North Carolina, who says, I am an evangelical. Those who focus on the poor can be evangelicals. Those who focus on enriching the rich have no business claiming the gospel of Christ. And I would say amen. The second thing that I would say, sorry, I don't need to get like that. I get passionate sometimes. The second thing in which I profoundly believe is that I want to understand everybody. But I don't want to just understand everybody for the sake of understanding everybody. Yes, the people of the Midwest, the rural areas, are overlooked. The bi-coastal elites fly over them. We hear this all the time. But you know who else they fly over? The people of Standing Rock. You know who else they fly over? The black residents of Flint, whose water was poisoned. And why did the Flint turn out, why was that so poor? That was because the Democrats went to Flint and said, this is terrible, and then they forgot about it. Because they thought Michigan was in their pocket. So for me, it's like, I don't want to just think about how do we reach out to those people who supported Trump because they're the ones who won. I want to think about who are we overlooking now, especially in the time of Trump, so that we wind up creating a new kind of majority that is profoundly inclusive and not hateful and resentful. This is what the UU Vision taught me when I was in Ann Arbor, and I feel the spirit here. I don't know what principle it is, but it's one of them.
Hey, right on.